Harlem, New York, 1935. At the height of segregation, there was a place that symbolized both black brilliance and racial humiliation at the same time. A nightclub built on black music, black talent, and black culture, yet reserved exclusively for white audiences. The Cotton Club. It was where downtown Manhattan's elite came to feel dangerously entertained, listening to jazz legends while being served by black waiters, all under one unspoken rule: black people could perform, but they could never belong. On one September evening, that rule collided with a man who understood power better than almost anyone else in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson. What began as a single racist insult at the door of a whites-only club would quietly ignite one of the most sophisticated economic counterattacks Harlem had ever seen. No riots, no gunfire, no headlines at first. Just patience, strategy, and pressure applied so precisely that it forced one of the most notorious segregated institutions in New York to bend. This is not just a story about racism. It is a story about how humiliation became leverage, how silence became organization, and how one man turned being told, "You don't belong here," into a victory that reshaped Harlem's power structure forever. Harlem, Thursday evening, the 19th of September 1935, just after 8:15 p.m., Bumpy Johnson approached the entrance of the Cotton Club dressed with deliberate precision. A navy blue suit that had cost him 3 months of earnings from his policy operations, a crisp white shirt with French cuffs, shoes polished until they caught the glow of the streetlights. He looked no different from the white businessmen who routinely walked through those doors without question. The Cotton Club itself stood as a contradiction carved into Harlem's streets, a venue built entirely on black music and black labor, famous for launching careers like Duke Ellington's, yet rigidly committed to a whites-only audience. Johnson was there because he had been invited by Jacob Weinstein, a legitimate Jewish businessman who believed a discreet business discussion could take place inside, assuming an exception could be made for someone of Johnson's stature. That assumption collapsed the moment Johnson reached the door. The doorman, Thomas Murphy, stepped directly into his path, blocking the entrance with practiced confidence. In a voice loud enough for those waiting behind to hear, Murphy made it clear that black patrons were not welcome, reducing Johnson to a racial stereotype and ordering him back to where he belonged, threatening police involvement if he didn't comply. The line of white customers watched closely, some amused, some approving, waiting to see whether this well-dressed black man would protest or submit. Johnson instantly understood the trap. Any argument would only provide entertainment, justification for violence, and a story that ended with him humiliated or arrested. Instead, he did the one thing no one expected. He smiled, not warmly, but deliberately locking eyes with Murphy just long enough for uncertainty to flicker across the doorman's face. Then Johnson nodded once, turned away from the entrance, and walked down West 142nd Street with unhurried steps, his posture calm, his silence absolute. To anyone watching, it looked like acceptance. In reality, it was calculation. That walkaway was not surrender. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous than anger. After leaving the Cotton Club, Bumpy Johnson didn't head home. He walked. For nearly 15 minutes, he moved through Harlem's night streets with no destination in mind, using the rhythm of his steps to cool his anger and sharpen his thinking. He understood something crucial in that moment. What had just happened was not personal. The doorman hadn't insulted him as an individual, he had enforced a system where white patrons could flood into Harlem to consume black culture, while black people themselves were barred from the very rooms where their music created wealth. Arguing at the door would have changed nothing. Violence would have changed nothing. Only structure could. Johnson eventually stopped outside the Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue, watching black couples, workers, professionals, and families enter freely welcomed, respected, belonging. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The Savoy was owned and operated by black businessmen, served black patrons with dignity, and kept its profits circulating inside the community. And suddenly, standing there, Johnson saw the Cotton Club for what it truly was: a business physically planted in Harlem, powered entirely by black musicians and black labor, yet owned by white men who extracted enormous wealth while giving almost nothing back. The Cotton Club didn't exist despite Harlem, it existed because of Harlem. That realization shifted everything. The Cotton Club's owners believed their position was untouchable because individual black people had no leverage. Musicians needed the work, staff needed the wages. Patrons had no legal right to enter. But Johnson saw a flaw they hadn't considered. The club depended on Harlem's cooperation at every level, its labor, its location, its silence. If that cooperation were withdrawn, not through chaos, but through coordination, the entire operation could be destabilized. In that moment, the insult at the door stopped being an act of humiliation and became a strategic opening. The question was no longer whether the Cotton Club could be challenged, but how to make discrimination so expensive that it could no longer survive. Johnson turned from the Savoy with a plan forming, already thinking about who needed to be involved, who held influence, and how pressure could be applied without triggering a violent crackdown. What began as a quiet walk through Harlem had become something far more dangerous to the status quo, the beginning of an organized response. The plan didn't stay theoretical for long. That same night, Bumpy Johnson stopped at a payphone on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 141st Street and made 3 calls that would quietly mobilize power from 3 different worlds. The first was to Theodore Green, Johnson's lawyer and most trusted advisor, a man who understood both the legal system and how pressure could be applied without leaving fingerprints. The second call went to Stephanie Street, Claire, the undisputed queen of Harlem's policy racket and Johnson's former mentor, a woman whose reach extended into nearly every block of the neighborhood. The third call was the most unexpected to Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the powerful pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, a moral authority who had preached against discrimination for years, but had never possessed the raw leverage to force white institutions to change. By midnight, roughly 15 people gathered in the back room of a Harlem speakeasy on 133rd Street. They came from different backgrounds: Johnson's top associates, rival policy operators, union representatives, church leaders, doctors, lawyers, all people who had felt the quiet sting of exclusion in white spaces. Johnson stood at the head of the table and described exactly what had happened at the Cotton Club. He spoke calmly, without drama, his voice low enough that everyone leaned in. As he talked, curiosity turned into anger, and anger hardened into something more focused. They understood immediately that this was bigger than one man being insulted. It was about a system that extracted black wealth while denying black dignity. When Johnson finished, the room was silent. Then he explained why the Cotton Club was vulnerable in ways its owners had never considered. The club relied entirely on black musicians, black staff, black suppliers, and black tolerance. Its appeal depended on being located in Harlem, on selling white patrons, the illusion of experiencing black culture from a safe distance. That meant the Cotton Club could not function if Harlem stopped cooperating. Johnson made it clear this would not be about violence or spectacle. Burning the club down would only bring insurance money and police attention. Attacking white patrons would justify crackdowns. Instead, the goal was pressure slow, coordinated, and expensive, applied from every direction at once. Either the Cotton Club would end its discriminatory policy, or it would collapse under the cost of maintaining it. What happened in that room wasn't a rant. It was a blueprint. For the first time, criminal networks, labor influence, religious authority, and community organization were being aligned toward a single objective. The insult at the door had become a collective mission, and everyone there understood that once this machine started moving, it wouldn't stop easily. With the room aligned, Bumpy Johnson laid out the strategy in precise, unemotional terms. This would not be a single blow. It would be pressure applied everywhere the Cotton Club was exposed. First came labor. Every black employee, musicians, waiters, kitchen staff would be approached quietly and asked to act together. No dramatic walkouts, no obvious sabotage, just coordinated demands for higher pay, better conditions, and respect. If management refused, Productivity would slow in ways that couldn't justify firings but would frustrate patrons and inflate costs. Service would become uneven, wait times would stretch, complaints would rise. Next came supply lines. The Cotton Club depended on Harlem vendors for food, liquor, linens, and repairs. Through Johnson's and Stephanie Street, Claire's connections, suppliers were given a choice: keep servicing a discriminatory club or keep access to Harlem's broader market. Most chose Harlem. Deliveries began arriving late or incomplete. Emergency replacements cost more. Reliability vanished. At the same time, churches and community groups guided by Adam Clayton Powell Sr. made the club's racism public. Sermons named it, meetings discussed it, silence ended. The goal wasn't to stop white patrons from coming, it was to make the policy indefensible and embarrassing. Regulatory pressure followed. Inspections suddenly found issues that required fixes. Paperwork slowed. Licenses raised questions. Nothing that shut the doors outright, just enough friction to drain money and attention. And finally, competition. Johnson and Street Claire backed alternative venues that welcomed black patrons and paid musicians competitively. If talent and labor had better options, the Cotton Club's leverage collapsed. Individually, none of these moves were fatal. Together, they were suffocating. This was the genius of the plan. Legitimacy and intimidation braided so tightly that no single culprit could be targeted. No spectacle for police. No clear enemy to crush. Only rising costs, falling quality, and a growing realization that maintaining segregation was becoming more expensive than abandoning it. The campaign began quietly the following Monday, and almost immediately, the Cotton Club felt the strain. By the second week, the Cotton Club's problems were no longer subtle. Duke Ellington, the club's biggest draw and the reason many white patrons came downtown, demanded a 50% increase in pay and improved working conditions. Management refused, citing his contract. Ellington didn't back down. He made it clear he had offers elsewhere, offers that Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie Street Claire had quietly arranged. Losing Ellington would cripple the club's reputation, and management knew it. At the same time, service quality deteriorated. Kitchen staff moved carefully, too carefully, slowing output. Orders arrived late. Waiters made small, deniable mistakes that stacked into customer frustration. Suppliers missed deliveries, then charged premiums for rush replacements. Labor costs rose as management tried to buy loyalty with raises. Inspections piled on expenses. Nothing stopped the shows, but everything bled money. The owner, Oni Madden, understood this wasn't coincidence. He reached out through his underworld contacts and kept hearing the same name, Bumpy Johnson. Madden threatened retaliation, but he also knew the math. Harlem was Johnson's territory. Violence would trigger a costly war, invite law enforcement, and solve nothing. The coalition would continue without Johnson if necessary. After weeks of losses, Madden agreed to talk. The meeting came through Theodore Green. Calmly, Green explained the terms. The problems would stop when the Cotton Club ended its whites-only policy, not theatrics, not half measures. A public commitment to admit and serve black patrons like anyone else. Madden raged, then calculated. The threat was clear and credible. Fighting would cost more than surrender. On the 15th of October 1935, Madden issued a statement announcing the Cotton Club would welcome patrons regardless of race. Skepticism followed, so a test was arranged. Days later, well-dressed black professionals arrived at the door and were admitted, seated, and served. The barrier fell not to fire or fists, but to organized pressure that made discrimination untenable. The integration of the Cotton Club sent shockwaves through Harlem. If the most notorious whites-only venue in the neighborhood could be forced to change, then no discriminatory establishment was truly untouchable. Over the months that followed, similar pressure was applied elsewhere. Some venues integrated quickly, choosing survival over resistance. Others tried to hold out and learned the same lesson. Segregation carried a cost they could no longer afford. What mattered most wasn't just the doors opening, it was the method. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that power didn't always announce itself with violence, that patience, coordination, and economic leverage could accomplish what moral arguments and legal appeals often could not. The strategy labor organization, supply disruption, community mobilization, and targeted pressure would echo through civil rights campaigns in the decades to come. The doorman who had called Johnson boy likely never understood what he set in motion. He probably kept working after the policy changed, unaware that a casual insult at a doorway had sparked a campaign that reshaped Harlem's entertainment economy. Johnson's quiet walk away that night wasn't submission, it was calculation. Being told, "You don't belong here," became the catalyst for proving that belonging isn't granted by gatekeepers, it's claimed by communities that organize and refuse to be ignored. That is how one man's humiliation became a collective victory. Not with headlines at first, not with bloodshed, but with sustained pressure until the powerful decided that exclusion cost more than equality. The Cotton Club integrated in October 1935 because Bumpy Johnson chose strategy over spectacle and in doing so changed Harlem forever.